Hey everyone, this is an entry into a companion to Marx. The piece is titled Proletariat, and it's by Marcel van der Linden. Section 1. In his mid-20s, Karl Marx arrived at the conclusion that the proletariat is the only social force that is capable of transcending capitalism. His contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right in 1844 characterizes the proletariat as, quote, a class in civil society, which is not a class of civil society, and a state which is the dissolution of all estates, a sphere which has a universal character by its universal suffering and claims no particular right, because no particular wrong, but wrong generally, is perpetrated against it. End quote. Marx, 1844. A contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. The proletariat is the, quote, all-round antithesis, end quote, to existing society, which is, quote, the complete loss of man, and hence can win itself only through the complete rewinning of man, end quote. Contribution to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. Gradually, the nature of proletarian self-emancipation became clearer to him. In the German ideology, written between 1845 to 46, Marx asserts that the abolition of bourgeois society will require the collective reappropriation of all productive forces. This can only be effected through, quote, a revolution in which, on the one hand, the power of the earlier mode of production and intercourse and social organization is overthrown, and on the other hand, there develops the universal character and the energy of the proletariat, which are required to accomplish the appropriation, and the proletariat moreover rids itself of everything that still clings to the proletariat from its previous position in society. End quote. Marx, The German Ideology, or Marx and Engels, The German Ideology. These passages from Marx articulate at least four trends. First, the notion of classes and class struggles, which date back to the 18th century debates. During the decades preceding the 1789 French Revolution, social analysts such as Quinet, Turgot, and others began to distinguish two or three social classes. In Britain, Hume, Ferguson, and others developed similar distinctions almost at the same time. A possible explanation for this discovery of social classes is the growth of national states, combined with expanding trading circuits, and the increasing income differences that resulted from this. In addition, the rise of manufacturers and factories gradually made it impossible for journeymen and other skilled workers to become independent entrepreneurs themselves. Just like the French and British authors before, the early Marx did not distinguish between, quote, classes and, quote, estates. In the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, for example, the proletariat was still called a, quote, estate, end quote. But this confusion did not last long. In The Poverty of Philosophy, published in 1847, the proletariat had already become a, quote, class, end quote. Second, Marx was probably influenced by Lorenz von Stein, who lived from 1815 to 1900, 1815 to 1890, who, in 1842, had published a book on the socialism and communism of contemporary France. Wikipedia says, Lorenz von Stein, who lived from 1815 to 1890, was a German economist, sociologist, public administration scholar from Eckernförde. As an advisor to Meiji period Japan, his liberal political views influenced the wording of the Constitution of the Empire of Japan, as well as major constitutional thinkers such as Rudolf von Gneist. According to Colin Gordon, Stein articulated a, quote, vision of a liberal state as active historic partner in the making of civil society, end quote, and called for a, quote, a tabling of the question of class formation as part of the state's agenda, end quote. Lorenz von Stein advocated a combination of constitutional liberal state with a welfare state and has been called the, quote, intellectual father of the welfare state. Stein and other Hegelian liberals such as Robert von Moll also had a profound influence on American progressivism. So that's Lorenz von Stein. So back to the text. Second, Marx was probably influenced by Lorenz von Stein, who lived from 1815 to 1890, who in 1842 had published a book on the socialism of communism and communism of contemporary France, which foreshadowed much of Marx's class theory. Von Stein thought that the rising industrial society made workers either obstinate and malicious or transformed them into dull instruments and servile subordinates. Von Stein considered personal and hereditary property as the root cause of this decline of the working class, since it resulted in the dominant power of some and the unfreedom of others. Footnote: L. von Stein, Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus des heutigen Frankreichs. Ein Beitrag zur Zeitgeschichte. Geschichte. Excuse me. End footnote. With observations like these, von Stein anticipated some major arguments of historical materialism, but, quote, unlike Marx, he did not postulate an inexorable proletarian revolution which would ultimately resolve societal contradictions. Instead, he proposed a fundamentally reformist political strategy in which the state guides the distribution of economic forces in a form that would prevent the class polarization. Oh no, there's a typo here. It says polarizes, but it doesn't make sense. The class polarization envisioned by Marx, end quote. Footnote. J. Zingelmann and P. Zingelmann, quote, Lorenz von Stein and the paradigmatic bifurcation of social theory in the 19th century, end quote. End footnote. Third, Marx had been deeply impressed by the rebellion of Silesian weavers in 1844. In his, quote, critical notes on the article, quote, The King of Prussia and Social Reform by a Prussian, end quote, he pointed out that in the Silesian weavers' rebellion, quote, the proletariat at once, in a striking, sharp, unrestrained, and powerful manner, proclaims the proletariat's opposition to the society of private property. The Silesian rebellion begins precisely with what the French and English workers uprisings end, with consciousness of the nature of the proletariat. The action itself bears the stamp of this superior character. Not only were machines, these rivals of the workers, destroyed, but also ledgers, the titles to property, and while all other movements were aimed primarily only against the owner of the industrial enterprise, the visible enemy, this movement is at the same time directed against the banker, the hidden enemy, end quote. Marx. Robin Blackburn, born 1940, has rightly observed that much of this article, quote, is still written in the old philosophical jargon and concerns an argument about the nature of the German Revolution. But Marx concludes from the Weavers' Revolt that the proletariat is the, quote, active agent, end quote, of the revolution, end quote. Footnote. Blackburn, Marxism, Theory of Proletarian Revolution, New Left Review, 1976. Fourth and last, Friedrich Engels published The Conditions of the Working Class in England from Personal Observations and Authentic Sources in 1845. Basing himself on Manchester's textile industry, Engels suggested how manufacture, quote, centralizes property in the hands of the few, end quote, and therefore how the working population becomes centralized, as, quote, a manufacturing establishment requires many workers employed together in a single building, living near each other and forming a village of themselves in the case of a good-sized factory, end quote. Engels, The Conditions of the Working Class in England from Personal Observation and Authentic Sources. End footnote. In combination, these influences brought Marx to his analysis of human history as a history of class struggles that would culminate in the class struggle to end all class struggles, that is, the proletarian revolution. Marx's approach has forever changed the way in which we think about historical developments in radical politics. Marx was quick to admit that many important elements of his theory of revolution had been anticipated by others. In 1852, he wrote Joseph Weidemeyer. Arnold Weidemeyer, who lived from 1818 to 1866, was a military officer in the Kingdom of Prussia and the United States, as well as a journalist, politician, and Marxist revolutionary. At first a supporter of, quote, true socialism, end quote, Weidemeyer became in 1845 to 46 a follower of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and a member of the Communist League, the League of Communists. Heading its Frankfurt chapter from 1849 to 1851, he visited Marx in Brussels, staying there for a time to attend Marx's lectures. He participated in the 1848 revolution. Weidemeyer was Weidemeyer was one of the, quote, responsible editors, end quote, of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung from 1849 to 1850. He acted on Marx's behalf in the failed publication of the manuscript of the German ideology. Weidemeyer worked on two socialist periodicals, which were the Westfälisches Dampfboot, the Westphalian steamboat, and the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. In 1851, Joseph Weidemeyer emigrated from Germany to the United States and worked there as a journalist. The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, written by Marx, was published in 1852 in Die Revolution, a German-language monthly magazine in New York established by Weidemeyer. Weidemeyer took part in the American Civil War and was a lieutenant colonel in the Union Army. Anyway, back to the text. In 1852, Marx wrote Joseph Weidemeyer, who lived from 1818 to 1866, quote, now as for myself, I do not claim to have discovered either the existence of classes in modern society or the struggle between classes in modern society. Long before me, bourgeois historians had described the historical development of this struggle between the classes, as had bourgeois economists their economic anatomy. My own contribution was one, to show that the existence of classes is merely bound up with certain historical phases in the development of production. 2, that the class struggle necessarily leads to the dictatorship of the proletariat. 3, that this dictatorship itself constitutes no more than a transition to the abolition of all classes and to a classless society, end quote. Marx. To Joseph Weidemeyer, 5th of March, 1852. Section 2. Defining the proletariat. Neither in his early nor in his later work did Marx use the term, quote, working class, end quote, frequently. He preferred the notion of the proletariat, an ancient Roman conception, probably dating from the 6th century BCE. It describes a relatively large but not well-defined group of free, poor citizens whose, quote, offspring, bracket, proles, end bracket, end quote, could serve the empire as soldiers. See footnote. R. Zenivsky, something in French. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the word, quote, proletariat, end quote, made a comeback. Initially, it was used in a general sense to describe the estate of people without property beyond honor. The workers are only part of this amorphous mass. According to the French nobleman Adolphe Granier de Cassagnac, writing in the 1830s, sorry, I'm going to look this guy up. Wikipedia says, Adolphe Granier de Cassagnac was a French journalist and politician who lived from 1806 to 1880. According to the French, so back to the text. According to the French nobleman Granier de Cassagnac, writing in the 1830s, the proletariat formed, quote, the lowest rank, the deepest stratum of society, end quote, which consisted of four groups, quote, the workers, the beggars, the thieves, and public women, end quote. Quote, the worker is a proletarian because the worker works in order to live and earns a wage. The beggar is a proletarian who does not want to work or cannot work, and begs in order to live. The thief is a proletarian who does not want to beg, to work or beg, and, in order to make a living, steals. The prostitute is a proletarian who neither wants to work nor beg nor steal, and in order to live, sells her body, end quote. Adolphe Granier de Cassagnac. A few years later, Heinrich Wilhelm Benson. Wikipedia says, there's nothing before this person. A few years later, Heinrich Wilhelm Benson, who lived from 1798 to 1863, distinguished 7 categories of proletarians. Apart from 3 groups of workers, he also noted, quote, the poor who are bereft of support from the public purse, end quote, quote, the common soldiers, end quote, quote, gypsies, prostitutes, bandits, etc., end quote, the small servants of religious and secular origin, end quote. H.W. Benson, or Heinrich Wilhelm Benson. Gradually, a differentiation was made that could have one of 2 outcomes. Either the workers declared that they were not proletarians, but a separate class or a state, or the workers identified with the proletariat and started to see the other groups who had previously also been considered as proletarians to be, quote, less and, quote, different. The German communist workers in London, with whom Marx and Engels were associated, favored the second outcome. In the manifesto of the Communist Party, which Marx and Engels were instructed to write for these workers on the basis of common discussions, quote, the modern working class, the proletarians, end quote, were seen as a unity. The thieves, beggars, and prostitutes were now devaluated as a lower stratum, the lumpen proletariat, quote, the, quote, dangerous class, end quote, the social scum, that passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of old society, which may, here and there, be swept in to the movement by a proletarian revolution. Its conditions of life, however, prepare it far more for the part of a bribed tool of reactionary intrigue, end quote. Marx and Engels, Manifesto of the Communist Party. This exclusion of the, quote, immoral, end quote, part of the lower classes was combined with further demarcations. For Marx, it was self-evident that chattel slaves did not belong to the proletariat. Quite early, the European labor movement had already distanced themselves from their bonded brothers and sisters. The famous London Corresponding Society, which E.P. Thompson called a, quote, new kind of organization, end quote, of a working class nature, in 1792 redefined its constituency under the influence of the slave revolution of Saint-Domingue. In the early months of that year, the London Corresponding Society declared that the equality among all, quote, black or white, high or low, rich or poor, end quote. But by August, the, quote, black or white, end quote, disappeared from the society's agenda once the news reached from the Caribbean reached the British Isles. Quote, Race had thus become a tricky and, for many in England, a threatening subject, one that the leadership of the London Corresponding Society now preferred to avoid, end quote. Peter Linebaugh and M. Rediker, The Many-Headed Hydra, Sailors, Slaves, Commoners, and the Hidden History of the Revolutionary Atlantic. End footnote. Marx later was to reduce chattel slavery to, quote, an anomaly in relation to the bourgeois system itself, end quote, which, quote, can exist as individual points within the bourgeois system of production, end quote, although, quote, only because it does not exist at other points, end quote. Outlines of the Critique of Political Economy, or Grundrisse. Marx equally marked the proletariat off from the petty bourgeoisie. The manifesto of the Communist Party declares, quote, of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry, end quote. Manifesto of the Communist Party. Quote, the lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all of these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary but conservative, ... If by chance they are revolutionary, they are so only in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat, ... They deserve their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat. They desert their own standpoint to, they desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat, end quote. Manifesto of the Communist Party. Thus the boundaries of the proletariat were delimited on all sides. The class struggle is seen to be waged mainly between capitalist landowners and wage earners. The other intermediate classes are historically less important and play no independent political role. They, quote, decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry, end quote. In his later writings, Marx tried to further substantiate this thesis. Marx's critique of political economy is partly an attempt to circumscribe as precisely as possible the historical nature and social boundaries of the proletariat. In Capital Volume 1, he finally defines the pure proletarian as the worker who, quote, as a free man can dispose of his labor power as his own commodity, end quote, and, quote, on the other hand, has no other commodity for sale, end quote. Capital Volume 1. The ongoing process of capital accumulation will, according to Marx, let the number of these doubly free workers grow, both absolutely and relatively. For the larger the capitals, the more workers they need. Quote, accumulation of capital is therefore increase of the proletariat, end quote. Capitalist production, quote, reproduces to an ever-increasing extent the class of wage laborers, into whom it transforms the vast majority of direct producers, end quote. Capital Volume 2. The proletariat is recruited from, quote, all classes of the population, end quote. Quote, the lower strata of the middle class, the small tradespeople, shopkeepers, and retired tradesmen generally, the handicraftsmen and peasants, all these sink gradually into the proletariat, partly because their diminutive capital does not suffice for the scale in which modern industry is carried on, and is swamped in the competition with large capitalists, partly because their specialized skill is rendered worthless by the new methods of production, end quote. Communist Manifesto. Consequently, as the precise moment of revolutionary change approaches, capitalist society will be increasingly split up into two large hostile camps. It is argued here that Marx's delimitations of the proletariat did not always follow logically from his critique of political economy. Moral impulses, political cogitations, and wishful thinking probably played an important role in Marx's considerations. Accordingly, significant contradictions were unavoidable while historical facts had to be denied. The examples of the lumpen proletariat and the chattel slaves can arguably corroborate this contention. Section 3. Excluding the lumpen proletariat. Everybody, I'm recording outside now in a public place, so you might hear people talking or chit-chatting in the background. And if you don't like that, you can just turn off the recording and do something else with your time. Okay. Excluding the proletariat. The quote, lumpen proletariat, end quote, makes its initial appearance in the early writings of Marx and Engels, where Marx and Engels discuss the ancient Roman Empire. The notion turns up for the first time in the German ideology, 1845 to 46. In a passage discussing the issue of the plebeians who, quote, midway between freemen and slaves never succeed in becoming more than a proletarian rabble, end quote. Is that what lumpen proletariat translates into? Proletarian rabble? Who knows? However, as a contemporary concept, the lumpen proletariat makes its first appearance during the years 1848 to 51, when Marx analyzed French revolutionary and counter-revolutionary trends. Marx was struck by his observation of the workers' actions and reactions on both sides of the barricades, an apparent absurdity that he could only explain by valuing those on the good side as, quote, real, end quote, proletarians, and devaluing those on the wrong side as pseudo-proletarians. Footnote. This led to a certain ambivalence. The, quote, wrong, end quote, workers were and were not proletarians. Hal Draper pointed this out and observed a certain ambivalence on the question whether the lumpen proletariat is to be regarded as part of the proletariat or not. A quote, certain ambivalence on the question of whether the lumpen proletariat is to be regarded as a part of the proletariat or not, end quote. Hal Draper, the concept of the lumpen proletariat in Marx and Engels. In the class struggles in France, published in 1850, one can, for instance, read that the counter-revolutionary mobile guards, quote, belonged for the most part to the lumpen proletariat, which in all big towns forms a mass sharply differentiated from the industrial proletariat, end quote. Just a few lines later, Marx writes, however, that the, quote, Paris proletariat was confronted with an army drawn from its own midst, end quote. Marx, The Class Struggles in France, 1848 to 1850. When in 1851 the workers were again divided and some of them supported Louis Bonaparte, who lived from 1808 to 1873, Marx found some important justification for his analysis. In the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, 1851 to 52, he included in the lumpen proletariat not only, quote, decayed roues, end quote, or roues, end quote, of aristocratic descent, and, quote, ruined and adventurous offshoots of the bourgeoisie, end quote, but also, quote, vagabonds, discharged soldiers, discharged jailbirds, escaped galley slaves, rogues, mountebanks, lazarani, pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, macaroons, brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars, in short, the whole indefinite disintegrated mass, thrown hither and thither, which the French term la bohème. End quote. Marx. 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, 1851 to 52. This characterization begs an analytical and empirical question of which social groups Marx would have precisely meant. It seems that he attempts to lump together a range of the following groups. 1. Displaced peasants. The Communist Manifesto dissertates about the, quote, passively rotting mass thrown off by the lowest layers of old society, end quote. Communist Manifesto. Probably this is a reference to those former peasants who, through enclosures or other measures, were robbed of their means of existence, migrated to the cities, and became the unskilled part of the modern proletariat. If this is what Marx meant, then the difference between a recent ex-peasant who is becoming a proletarian rather than a lumpen proletarian seems to be a matter of attitude rather than of relation to the means of production. The proletarian has become more resigned to selling his labor power. Displaced peasants could also feature as, quote, people without a definite trade, vagabonds, gen sans feu et sans vue, end quote. But again, one would expect such people to turn into proletarians over time. Footnote. M. Cowling. Marx's Lumpen Proletariat and Murray's Underclass, Concepts Best Abandoned, in Cowling and Martin's edited volume, Marx's 18th Brumaire, Postmodern Interpretations, published by Pluto Press in 2002. End footnote. 2. Displaced proletarians. A second group is made up of urban workers without means of existence, men and women who have lost their jobs or are too old or too sick to find employment. It is true, of course, that Marx did not include this group in the lumpen proletariat in capital, but it is likely to assume that the long-term unemployed and other proletarians at the lowest level of existence, did resort to crime and prostitution. Cowling is justified in saying, quote, Marx is ambivalent about how easy it would be for a proletarian thrown out by one branch of industry to find employment in another. Some of his writing about the worker as a mere appendage of the machine suggests that one might turn easily from the appendage of one machine into the appendage of another. On the other hand, there are suggestions that people become so distorted by one machine that they are not suitable for work with another. Again, there may be problems about accepting factory life at all, which mean that one has to start life in a factory young, although perhaps moving to another factory might not be so difficult. Perhaps this ambiguity corresponds to real life in the mid-19th century. One factory might involve more training or more distortion of the person or worse conditions than another. The demand for hands would be greater at one time than another. Any difficulties would surely lead some proletarians towards lumpen expedients. End quote. Cowling. Marx's Lumpen Proletariat and Murray's Underclass. Three, self-employed. Marx's third category consists of, quote, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, end quote. 18th Brumaire. These groups have in common that they are self-employed and their occupations are unlicensed. Similarly, one can wonder if unemployed often performed these activities. Historical studies can attest to this. Footnote. For example, see G.S. Jones' Outcast London, a study in the relationship between classes in Victorian society, published in 1971. End footnote. 4. Dubious professions. Finally, we have the mountebanks, tricksters, gamblers, brothel keepers, and prostitutes. What the fuck is a mountebank? A mountebank is a person who deceives others, especially in order to trick them out of their money. A charlatan. What unites them is not a typical specific type of labor relation, but presumably the immoral nature of their work. Quote, what is going on here seems to be that Marx is including an assortment of occupations which command widespread dislike to make the lumpen proletariat seem less reputable rather than engaging any kind of serious social or socialist analysis, end quote. Cowling, Marx's Lumpen Proletariat and Murray's underclass. Apart from these deductions, the very complexity of Marx's analysis poses some empirical challenges. The historical sociologist Mark Proletariat, what the hell is that? I don't know, Proletariat, some guy at Santa Cruz. I don't know. The historical sociologist Mark Proletariat, who was born in 1947 and still alive, has made a careful and detailed study of 6 battalions comprising 3,845 individuals of the, quote, lumpen proletarian, end quote, mobile guard in 1848. Proletariat has concluded that the social composition of the workers on the wrong side of the barricades does not confirm Marx's hypothesis of the lumpen proletarian. Quote, first, if self-reported occupations tell us anything at all, first, if self-reported occupations tell us anything at all, the mobile guard consisted in the main of workers in artisanal trades requiring relatively high levels of skill and training. This is not to deny the presence of a scattering of occupations that fit descriptions of the lumpen proletariat. If, unsurprisingly, no mobile guardsman listed his previous occupation as pimp, beggar, or thief, one does find listed a handful of itinerant peddlers, a single rag picker, several street musicians, a magician, a mountebank, and a number of whom, quote, no profession, end quote, is specified. But even if one were to adopt a broad definition of lumpen proletarian status that included tinkers, scrap metal dealers, market porters, and literati of all kinds, one could come up with only 83 such individuals, or 3% of the total sample, end quote. That's from, what was his first name? Mark Proletariat. Armies of the Poor, Determination of Working Class Participation in the Prussian Insurrection of June 1848. That's published in 1985. See also P. Caspard, something in French, which I can't read. So, end quote, end footnote, or end footnote, end quote. van der Linden again. Marx's concrete analysis of the French situation was thus misleading. Besides, the social groups considered by Marx as lumpen proletarians have certainly not always been reactionaries. Victor Kiernan, was he like a sociologist from the UK? I feel like I've seen him like edit books about Marx, but maybe I'm thinking of someone else. It says Victor Kiernan. On Wikipedia, it says, Edward Victor Gordon Kiernan lived from 1913 to February 2009, was a British historian and member of the Communist Party Historians Group. Kiernan's work was prominent in the field of Marxist historiography in Britain, analyzing historical events from a Marxist point of view. Belonging to a group of prominent Marxist historians active in the 20th century, Kiernan was a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain from 1934 until 1959, when he left in protest of the party after the party's response to the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. He was also involved in promoting Urdu poetry among Western audiences. So that's Victor Kiernan. Anyway, Victor Kiernan has, for instance, argued that the London lumpen proletariat, after periods of seeming resignation, could break out like a cyclone, and once in movement, its actions were characterized, quote, by, quote, above all, audacity, spontaneity, disregard of the arbitrary chalk lines within which society coops up its fowl, a cheerful conviction that the law is an ass, end quote. Usually such waves of militancy followed in the wake of protests by, quote, ordinary, end quote, workers. Quote, It was when those who normally had jobs suffered acute spells of unemployment and showed signs of mutinying that the stragglers joined in and might go further, end quote. More in general, quote, lumpen proletarians, end quote. Quote, more in general, quote, lumpen proletarians, end quote. Shit, I keep fucking up. Or in general, quote, lumpen proletarians have often been a driving force in social struggles. Shit, I fucked it up again. I was right the first time. More in general, quote, lumpen proletarians, end quote, have often been a driving force in social struggles. Footnote. F. Bovenkirk, The Rehabilitation of the Rabble, How and Why Marx and Engels Wrongly Depicted the Lumpen Proletariat as a Reactionary Force. End footnote. Naturally, this doesn't make them a new vanguard, as has sometimes been suggested. Footnote. For example, Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. Compare the critique in P. Worsley, Frantz Fanon and the Lumpen Proletariat, The Socialist Register. End footnote. It underlines, however, that the, quote, lumpen proletariat, end quote, is not an analytical but a moral category. I want to repeat that again. It underlines, however, that the, quote, lumpen proletariat, end quote, is not an analytical but a moral category. This concept's untenability becomes particularly clear in the Global South. Sorry, there's a footnote here. It says, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the, quote, lumpen, end quote, concept became a foundation for socialist eugenics. End footnote. There's some text that was referenced by an M. Schwartz, but I don't. It's in German or maybe Dutch. I don't know. I'm not going to try to read it. There's no point. Okay, sorry. The concept lumpen proletariat's untenability becomes particularly clear in the Global South. Sorry. It talks about the next section's about Vic Allen, or not the next sentence. So, Wikipedia says Vic Allen, who lived from 1923 to 2014, was a British communist, human rights activist, political prisoner, sociologist, historian, economist, and emeritus professor at the University of Leeds. He worked closely with British trade unions and was considered a key player in the resistance against apartheid in South Africa. Vic Allen was also known for being a key activist within the Communist Party of Great Britain and spending his life supporting the South African National Union of Mine Workers. Allen was a mentor of British trade union leader Arthur Scargill and also a brief acquaintance of Nelson Mandela. During attempts to establish trade unions in Nigeria, he was accused of conspiring to overthrow the Nigerian government and spent 6 months in jail. Vic Allen was also involved in a successful mission to smuggle £10,000 into apartheid South Africa to fund trade unions, and in 1988 was present at the secret talks in Cuba between Fidel Castro and black South African Union leaders. In 2010, Allen was awarded the Kagao Ya Bala Award, the highest honor awarded by the South African NUM. After his death, After his death, Vic Allen was widely commended by his fellow academics and activists for his lifelong commitment to workers' rights and racial equality. Back to the text. Vic Allen has rightly claimed that in, quote, societies in which bare subsistence is the norm for a high proportion of all the working class, and where men, women, and children are compelled to seek alternative means of subsistence, as distinct from their traditional ones, the lumpen proletariat is barely distinguishable from much of the working class, end quote. Vic Allen, The Meaning of the Working Class in Africa, Journal of Modern African Studies. Back to the text. Fuzzy concepts like the, quote, informal sector, end quote, are an expression of such social conditions under which semi-proletarian households combine numerous activities to ensure their survival. Footnote. For example, see J. Bremen, Wage Hunters and Gatherers, Search for Work in the Urban and Rural Economy of South Gujarat. I don't know if I'm saying that right. End footnote. New section. Excluding chattel slaves. The contrast between, quote, free and, quote, wage labor and slavery is a recurring theme in Marx's oeuvre. As an expert on European antiquity and as a contemporary to the American Civil War, Marx was very much aware of the slavery problem. Capital Volume 1 was published 2 years after the abolition of slavery in the United States in 1865 and 21 years before it was officially proclaimed in Brazil. Marx considered slavery a historically backward mode of exploitation that would soon be a thing of the past, as, quote, free and, quote, wage labor embodied the capitalist future. He compared the two labor forms in several writings. He certainly saw similarities between them. Both produced a surplus product, and the, quote, wage laborer, like the slave, must have a master who puts him to work and rules over him, end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 3. At the time, Marx distinguished some differences that overshadowed all the common experiences they shared. 1. Ownership of labor power. Labor power can, according to Marx, quote, appear upon the market as a commodity only if, and insofar as labor power's possessor, the individuals whose labor power it is, offers his labor power for sale, or sells his labor power as a commodity. In order that he may be able to do this, he must have his labor power at his disposal, must be the untrammeled owner of his capacity for labor, i.e. of his person, end quote. Marx. The future wage laborer and the money owner, quote, meet in the market. Sorry, where is that from, Marx, actually? That's from Capital Volume 1. The future wage laborer and the money owner meet in the market and deal with each other as on the basis of equal rights, with this difference alone, that one is buyer, the other seller, both therefore equal in the eyes of the law, end quote. Marx, Capital. In other words, the workers have to, quote, own, end quote, their labor power and have to offer their labor power themselves on the market as a commodity. But why should that be so? History has given us many instances where workers' labor power was offered on the market, although not by the workers themselves. Child labor, where the parents or guardians of the child receive the wages, is one clear example. The slaves for hire who lived in various parts of the Americas and Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries can be given as another example. A Brazilian study described the situation of these slaves so-called ganhadores or hanhadores. I don't know how to say it. Ganhadores. A Brazilian study describes the situation of these slaves, so-called ganhadores, who as owners who had sent them into the city to earn wages as follows, quote, the ganhadores moved about freely in the streets looking for work. It was a common, although not general, practice for slave owners to permit their slaves to live outside the master's home in rented rooms, sometimes with former slaves as their landlord. They only returned to the master's house to, quote, pay for the week, end quote, that is, to pay the weekly and sometimes daily sum agreed upon with their masters. They were able to keep whatever exceeded that amount. Footnote. J.J. Rees, The Revolution of the Ganhadores, Urban Labor, Ethnicity, and African Strike of 1857 in Bahia, Brazil, Journal of Latin American Studies. Marx was aware of the existence of slaves for hire, but he did not draw any theoretical conclusions from this. See, for example, Marx, Capital, Volume 3. Quote, under a slave system, the laborer has a capital value, namely his purchase price, and when he is hired out, the hirer must pay, in the first place, the interest on this purchase price, and in addition, replace the annual wear and tear on the capital. End quote. Marx. End footnote. Two, duration of the labor relation. The crucial distinction between, quote, free, end quote, wage earners and slaves is, according to Marx, the duration of their labor relation. The wage laborer, quote, should sell it, bracket, his labor power, end bracket, only for a definite period. For if the wage laborer were to sell his labor power, rump and stump, once for all, the wage laborer would be selling himself, converting himself from a free man into a slave, from an owner of a commodity into a commodity. End quote. Marx. Capital, Volume 1. Ordinarily, one may call such a transaction, i.e. the piecemeal, quote, sale, end quote, of a commodity, without change of ownership, letting, and not sale, an obvious thought that was expressed a long time ago. Footnote. F. Oppenheimer, Die soziale Frage und der Sozialismus, eine kritische Auseinandersetzung mit der marxistischen Theorie. I don't know. Marx saw the analogy between wage labor and the hiring process. For instance, compare his remarks that, quote, the price of the labor power is fixed by the contract, although it is not realized till later, like the rent of a house, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. End footnote. The difference between selling and letting seems insignificant, but it is not. If A sells a commodity to B, then B becomes the owner instead of A. But if A hires out a commodity to B, then A remains the owner, and B only gains the right to use the commodity for a certain period of time. The commodity's, quote, substance, end quote, remains with A, while B gets the usufruct. If wage labor is based on hiring and not on buying labor power, then the crucial difference between a wage laborer and a slave is not the, quote, definite period, end quote, during which the labor power is alienated, but the letting of labor power is one thing and its sale another. Why did Marx not concede this? Presumably because it would put a different complexion on the creation of value. After all, the substance, the value of the wage earner's labor power, would then not be appropriated by the capitalists, but it would have remained the property of the worker. Engels thought that house renting is, quote, a transfer of already existing, previously produced value, and that therefore, quote, the total sum of values possessed by the landlord and the tenant together remain the same as it was before, end quote. Marx. Or no, Engels, the housing question, excuse me. Following this argument, a wage laborer would not be capable of producing surplus value if the wage relationship were a form of hiring/letting. 3. Fixed versus variable capital. Because the duration of the labor relationship is seen as the main difference between the wage earner and the slave, The wage earner represents variable capital, and the slave fixed constant capital. The wage labor embodies, quote, that part of capital, end quote, which, quote, both produces the equivalent of its own value and also produces an excess, a surplus value, which given the circumstances may itself vary more or less. This part of capital is continually being transformed from a constant into a variable magnitude. I therefore call it the variable part of capital, or shortly, variable capital. End quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1. Chattel slaves are, according to Marx, economically indistinguishable from cattle or machines. Quote, the slave owner buys his labor as he buys his horse, end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1. The slave's purchase price is his capital value, and this has to be depreciated over a number of years. Footnote, Marx Capital Volume 3. But how is it justified to define only wage labor as variable capital because, quote, that part of capital, end quote, can be, quote, more or less, end quote, according to circumstances? Is the same not true for commodity-producing slave labor? Slave prices could fluctuate enormously and slaves could be sold at any time. Yeah, that's one of the tricky points about, like, the degree to which slavery was capitalist or not, was the degree to which people think that slave holders could sell their slaves or not, right? If, like, the slaves can be sold fast, then you could, in fact, like, shed labor from the production process. But if selling slaves was difficult, that would be less the case, right? So, like, if you have a slave and you can't sell it, and production's contracting or the market's contracting, or just, like, it would make sense to have, for whatever reason, less slaves that you have to take care of, or whatever, than what so that your plantation or whatever can be more profitable. Some people think for it to be truly capitalist, it would have to be like selling slaves would have to be an easy process. But if not, if you're stuck with slaves like the way you are stuck with like a machine or something like that, that fundamentally changes the nature of the production process, right? It doesn't incentivize, like, owning slaves doesn't incentivize innovation if it's difficult to get rid of them. If you're stuck with the slaves, you might as well use the slaves as opposed to, like, reinvesting in the production process. I'm giving a very bastardized explanation of that, but if you look at, for instance, the work of Charles Post, his The American Road to Capitalism, I think you'd get a lot more richer picture than what I'm giving here. I would say that, like, it would be very worthwhile use of your time and my time to explore deeper the political Marxist tradition, as in the sense of, like, which is usually referred to, like, Ellen Mason's Wood, Robert Brenner, the one guy whose book I was reading that I never finished, the fuck his name, Jmolik, can't remember his first name. Is it Andrew Jmolik? Like, those kinds of people who, like, I don't know, apply the critique that probably apply more regularly than a lot of people, the critique of political economy to historical sociology. I think learning more about those people would definitely behoove me and yourself. So check out Charlie Post's book, The American Road to Capitalism. It's something. What's it? John Clegg, I think his name is, disagrees with a lot of, like, the fundamental thesis of the book, insofar as, like Charlie Post substantially doesn't think that slavery was capitalist, whereas John Clegg, who used to write for EndNotes, and he's been in, like, he was in the Sage Handbook, of Frankfurt School Critical Theory, writing with, I think he wrote a piece of Aaron Benanov, I can't remember how to pronounce his name, about like crisis or something like that. But yeah, I should check out Clegg's work. You know, a lot of socialists get so caught up in like capitalism being like the anti-capitalism Uberalis, that the only way that a society could be bad is if it's capitalist or something like that. But I think, I don't know, but I think, so like it doesn't necessarily, just because a society's not capitalist doesn't mean it's not like morally abhorrent or something like that. Hey everybody, sorry about that last little bout. There was like people cutting lawns right next to me, and there's always two things you always forget about summertime. Is that there's always someone asshole fucking cutting the grass. There can never just not be grass cutting. There always must be grass cutting going on, and there also must be there's always mosquitoes. So, you know, winter has its merits, you know. What was I gonna say? But I guess I wouldn't be outside if it wasn't nice outside, and I guess I wouldn't be able to sit in this grass if someone didn't cut it. So I guess I should thank my lucky stars. But Christ, nothing's perfect, you know. Anyway. 4. Creation of value and surplus value. If a wage laborer produces commodities, then these commodities are, quote, at the same time use values and values, end quote. And therefore, quote, the process of producing them must be a labor process and at the same time a process of creating value, end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1. But the same is obviously true for slaves growing cane sugar, tobacco, or indigo. They were also producing commodities just like wage earners. Therefore, slaves must have created value as well. Marx could not admit this, because slaves were fixed capital and only capital is capable of creating value. I think he meant to say variable capital. Is only capable of creating value, but maybe he said what he meant to say. Maybe it's not a typo. Concurrently, the wage laborer's labor power is a source of, quote, more value than itself, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Because, quote, labor pre-exists in the form of wage labor and the means of production in the form of capital, i.e. solely because of this specific social form of these two essential production factors, does a part of the value, product, appear as surplus value, and this surplus value is profit, rent, as the gain of the capitalist, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 3. Again, Marx thought that this was not true for the slave's labor. The slave owner had paid cash for his slave, and therefore, quote, the returns from the labor of the slave, ... merely represent the interest on the capital invested in this purchase, end quote. Historic Marx, Capital, Volume 3. Historically, however, the Caribbean sugar plantations based on slave labor were often extremely profitable because the sugar produced had much more value than the capital invested by the planters. Ground rent, depreciation of the slaves, depreciation of the sugarcane press, etc. Can one really maintain that only wage labor reproduces the equivalent of its own value and produces an excess amount of value, a surplus value? Or else is the chattel slave, quote, a source not only of value, but of more value than itself, end quote. 5. Rate of profit. According to Marx, the profit rate is tangentially declining, given the ongoing increase of labor productivity. Quote, since the mass of the employed living labor is continually on the decline as compared to the mass of objectified labor set in motion by it, i.e. to the productively consumed means of production, it follows that the portion of living labor, unpaid and congealed in surplus value, must also be continually on the decrease, compared to the amount of value represented by the invested total capital. End quote. Marx, Capital Volume 3. Naturally, the end of this development, the collapse of capitalism, will have been reached as soon as variable capital is reduced to zero, and total capital consists only of constant capital. Paradoxically, though it may seem, if we are to believe Marx, the future situation had already become a reality in the Caribbean slave plantations during the 18th century, with almost complete lack of variable capital and formidable capital accumulation. That's actually a very good point. Paradoxically, though, it may seem, if we are to believe Marx, this future situation had already become a reality in the Caribbean slave plantations during the 18th century, with almost complete lack of variable capital and formidable capital accumulation. Inconsistencies like these reveal that Marx's value theoretical approach of privileging productive wage labor was not well founded. Slaves and, quote, free, end quote, wage earners are more similar than is often acknowledged. Under capitalism, many intermediary and transitional forms between both modes of exploitation have existed. The ganadores are just one example. What is more, slaves and, quote, free, end quote, wage laborers have in many cases done the same work for the same capitalist, e.g. on Brazilian coffee plantations or in factories in the U.S. South. Footnote. See M. Hall and V. Stolka, The Introduction of Free Labor on Sao Paulo Coffee Plantations, Journal of Political Science of Peasant Studies. And see T.S. Whitman, Industrial Slavery at the Margin, The Maryland Chemical Works. End footnote. Evidently, the slave's labor power is forever the property of the slaveholder, while the labor power of the wage laborer is made available to the capitalist for short periods of time. Yet it is unclear why in the former case, no value and surplus value is created. It is high time to broaden the labor theory of value in such a way that it would embrace the slave and other unfree workers' labor power with an equal measure of applicability. Marx was apparently not completely convinced of his own analysis. Contrary to his own argument, he often indicated that he considered chattel slavery as a capitalist mode of exploitation all the same. Marx's wavering was apparent from his statement, quoted earlier, that slavery is, quote, an anomaly in relation to the bourgeois system itself, end quote, which, quote, can exist at individual points within the bourgeois system of production, end quote, but, quote, only because it does not exist at other points, end quote. Marx, Outlines of the Critique of Political Economy, Grundrisse, first installment, page 392, end footnote. In the first volume of Capital, while discussing slavery in the U.S. South, Marx noticed, quote, oh, fucker. Sorry, I just realized I left my coffee where I was sitting before. Marx noticed, quote, but in production as export, in the first volume of Capital, Marx while discussing slavery in the U.S. South, Marx noticed, quote, "But in proportion as the export of cotton became a vital interest to these states, the overworking of the Negro and sometimes the using up of the Negro's life in 7 years of labor became a factor in a calculating system. It was no longer a question of obtaining from him a certain quantity of useful products. It was now a question of production of surplus value itself," end quote. Marx, Capital Volume 1. In Capital Volume 3, Marx wrote about the slave economy. Quote, "The entire surplus labor of the laborers, which is manifested here in the surplus product, is extracted from them directly by the owner of all instruments of production, to which belong the land and, under the original form of slavery, the immediate producers themselves. Where the capitalist outlook prevails, as on American plantations, this entire surplus value is regarded as profit," end quote. That's from Marx, Capital Volume 3. And in the Grundrisse, Marx argued, quote, "that we now not only describe the plantation owners in America as capitalists, but that they are capitalists, is due to the fact that they exist as anomalies within a world market based upon free labor," end quote. Marx, Outlines of the Critique of Political Economy, Grundrisse. And in the Grundrisse, Marx argued, quote, "that we now not only describe the plantation owners in America as capitalists, but that," I'm rereading the same thing. I'll just reread it again, whatever. And in the Grundrisse, he argued, quote, "that we now not only describe the plantation owners in America as capitalists, but that they are capitalists, is due to the fact that the plantation owners in America exist as anomalies within a world market based upon free labor," end quote. Chattel slaves were thus an integral part of capitalism and produced surplus value, although this was impossible because they embodied fixed and not variable capital. I'm going to try to find this goddamn coffee mug. Section 5, Problematic Consequences. The exclusion of lumpen proletarians and chattel slaves was not well thought out. One gets the impression that Marx first proclaimed the double free wage earners as the revolutionary subject on philosophical grounds, and then collected some arguments that were partly of an ad hoc nature. The outcome was a theory of the working class fraught with empirical and logical inconsistencies, not only with respect to excluded groups like the lumpen proletariat and chattel slaves, but also when it comes to the, quote, real, end quote, proletariat in a narrow sense. First, most, quote, proletarian, end quote, movements in Marx's time were not based on the double free wage earners that he was thinking of. The Zalesian weavers, who in 1844 revealed to Marx the revolutionary potential of the proletariat, were not, quote, workers, end quote, in the Marxian sense. They were self-employed cottagers representing, quote, embryonic forms, end quote, of capitalist wage labor. Quote, they own the means of production and only obtain the raw materials from the merchant wholesaler, end quote. This is not to deny, of course, that these weavers who happened to be mainly women, quote, lived in constant dependency on the merchant wholesaler. Whenever the prices for cloth fell, the losses were passed on to the weavers in the form of wage cuts. An overabundance of labor and a shortage of capital on the part of the workers meant that the merchant capitalists were in a position to dictate almost at will the level of wages and the working conditions, end quote. Two footnotes here. There's a piece by Eugene Notz, it's in German, Warum der Weberaufstand kein Weberinnen Aufstand war, and U. Bitzegio, A. Kruka, and M. Boyka. And the next footnote is by C. von Hodenberg, Weaving Survival in the Tapestry of Village Life, Strategies and Status in the Silesian Weaver Revolt of 1844, in J. Koch, Rebellious Families, Household Strategies and Collective Action in the 19th and 20th Centuries. Published by New York and Oxford, Bergham, 2002. End footnote. The worker communists of the Communist League in London, upon whose request Marx and Engels authored the Communist Manifesto, were mostly semi-proletarianized journeymen working in artisanal shops and in putting out or sweating systems. The social basis of German social democracy in Marx's time can perhaps best be characterized as a, quote, popular movement of small producers, end quote. Footnote. T. Welskop. Das Banner der Brüderlichkeit, die deutsche Sozialdemokratie vom Vormärz bis zum sozialistischen Gesetz. End footnote. The social basis of the Paris Commune was somewhat similar. Footnote. See R.V. Gould, Insurgent Identities, Class, Community, and Protest in Paris from 1848 to the Commune. End footnote. Also, Marx very much overestimated the British workers' concentration in large workshops. Footnote. See R. Samuel, The Workshop of the World, Steam Power and Hand Technology in Mid-Victorian Britain. End footnote. Historical research indicates that during the 19th century, workers who were employed by large factories of the large-scale industries played a less significant role in the labor movements than the self-employed and artisans. Footnote. On the one hand, Marx considered workers as, quote, true, end quote, proletarians who were not qualified. On the other hand, he sometimes excluded workers from the proletariat who should have been included according to his own analysis. When Marx, for instance, discussed the relative surplus population in Capital, Volume 1, he regarded prostitutes as an important part of the actual lumpen proletariat. Marx Capital, Volume 1, page 637. Elsewhere, especially in the theories of surplus value, e.g., Karl Marx Economic Manuscripts of 1861 to 63, Marx claimed that prostitutes, if they worked for a brothel keeper, perform unproductive wage labor, like actors or musicians, and thus were, by implication, part of the proletariat in the narrow sense of the word. Oh, you fuck. My coffee fell over. I spent all this time looking for it. I found it. And then it falls over. That's a weird thing with like their unproductive wage labor thing, because I think in other places Marx talks about, like, uses like teachers as an example of like service workers who do produce surplus value if that factory if like a university is like a private university organized for profit and the teachers are like laborers there. So the idea that like prostitutes would be unproductive wage laborers, and like it's always important to keep in mind that when Marx speaks of like productive and unproductive labor, is generally speaking, I mean, although this essay seems like the author of this essay, Marcel van der Linden, could take qualms with it, but it seems like what he is usually referring to is not some kind of moral thing, right? It's not some kind of moral question of whether something's good or not, right? Like, someone producing, nuclear warheads or something like that, someone working in the arms industry, or I don't know, I don't know, any kind of number of socially damaging industries that one could think of and be productive insofar as they were producing commodities that were potential bearers of surplus value that can be disaggregated into profit, interest, rent, taxes, and so forth. So where was I? Okay, so end of footnote. A lot of footnotes on this page, so forgive me. Second, Marx overestimated the speed and size of proletarianization. It was, for example, wishful thinking when Marx and Engels asserted in the Manifesto of the Communist Party that, quote, that in, quote, existing society, private property is already done away with for 9/10 of the population. Its existence for the few is solely due to its non-existence in the hands of those 9/10, end quote. Footnote. Marx and Engels' Manifesto of the Communist Party. This was a clear exaggeration. Quote, this situation did around 1848 not even exist in advanced England, let alone in France and Germany, end quote. All right, I'm going to take a wild guess. If I'm right, you all have to buy me a drink. I don't drink, but, I don't know, buy me a soda. I'm going to assume this is from Engels, like, in the 1890s. Oh, I know it's from someone else, but I think Engels said something like relevant to that case, is like that we were over ambitious or something like that about our prospects for communist revolution in the mid 19th century or something later in his life, based upon the limited development of capitalism. Yeah. In the meantime, full proletarianization very much progressed in the advanced capitalist countries, although there existed counter-tendencies, such as the resurgence of sharecropping and self-employment. Footnote, see M. Wells, The Resurgence of Sharecropping, Historical Anomaly or Political Strategy, American Journal of Sociology, 1984. See Steinmetz and Eric Olin Wright, The Fall and Rise of the Petty Bourgeoisie, Changing Patterns of Self-Employment in the Post-War United States. And Bugenhold and Staubers, The Decline and Rise of Self-Employment in Work, Employment, and Society, published 1991. End footnote. Yet the worldwide capitalist expansion in Africa, Asia, and Latin America has only to a very limited extent resulted in the growth of a, quote, pure, end quote, proletariat. Quote, in class terms, the pattern of capitalist development on the periphery was capable of following the full, quote, proletarianizing, end quote, logic of the center, end quote. Footnote. K. Post, Revolution's Other World, Communism in the Periphery, 1917 to 39. See also Amin and van der Linden's edited volume, quote, Peripheral Labor, end quote, Studies in the History of Partial Proletarianization, end footnote. Third, Marx underestimated capitalism's ability to incorporate the proletariat. Marx, as we have seen, considered the proletariat as, quote, a class in civil society, which is not a class of civil society, end quote. Gradually, however, the proletariat has become part of civil society. At least three influences not foreseen by Marx probably played a role in this process. One, the political incorporation of the proletariat, partly also resulting from the efforts of labor movements. For the British case, Bert Morehouse, 1894 to 1954, has argued that, quote, the majority of the ruling class believed that incorporation was necessary to bind the masses to the prevailing system, but also wanted such integration to be constrained and channeled so that, though institutional forms might change and could be promoted as having changed, the differential distribution of power in society would remain unaltered, end quote. Bert Morehouse. Footnote. H.F. Morehouse The political incorporation of the British working class in interpretation. End footnote. Two. End footnote. 2. The incorporation of proletarians as consumers. It is true that Marx and the Grundrisse has drawn our attention to the capitalist attempt to spur the workers, quote, on to consumption, to endow his commise with new attractions, to talk the workers into feeling new needs, etc., end quote. But nowhere did Marx evince to have understood the huge implications of the proletariat's golden chains. Footnote. Marx' Outline of a Critique of Political Economy, Grundrisse and M.A. Leibowitz, following Marx, that's Michael Leibowitz, Marx Method, Critique, and Crisis. 3. End footnote. 3. Technological changes of labor processes have had a double consequence. Quote, 1. A drastic and continuing reduction in the production worker component, and 2, a vast proliferation of job categories in the distribution and service sectors of the economy, end quote. Footnote. See Paul Sweezy, Marx and the Proletariat, Monthly Review, 1967, and R. Edward Sweezy and the Proletariat, and Stephen Resnick and Richard Wolff's edited volume, Rethinking Marxism, Struggles in Marxist Theories, Essays for Harry Magdoff and Paul Sweezy, end footnote. Final section, titled A Final Word. Marx's theory of the proletariat is in need of serious reconsideration. Marx's theory of the proletariat's theoretical demarcation of the proletariat with regard to other subaltern groups, the self-employed and chattel slaves, is inconsistent. The concrete analyses based on this theory have, to a significant extent, been refuted by empirical historical research, and its forecast of the growth of the proletariat has only been confirmed partly by later developments. Arguably, we need a new conceptualization of the proletariat that is based on inclusion rather than exclusion. Such a conceptualization can be achieved in 2 ways. One option is to do away with the idea of, quote, anomalies, end quote, and consider all forms of market-oriented labor, including unfree labor, as variations of capital-positing labor. This is the position advocated by Jaris Banaji and Rakesh Banderi. Or Banderi. I don't know who Rakesh Banderi is, but I know who Jaris Banaji is. It implies that the differences between chattel slaves, sharecroppers, and wage earners are only of a gradual nature. It doesn't really say anything about Bandari, except that he works at UC Berkeley. It implies that the differences between chattel slaves, sharecroppers, and wage earners are only of a gradual nature, since all of them work for capital and labor under economic or non-economic compulsion, and/or non-economic compulsion. Quote, finding the essence of wage labor and capital positing activity not only allows a change in the extension of the concept and thereby a challenge to the apologetic Eurocentric occlusion of slavery and colonialism in the writing of the history of capitalism, it also allows us to throw into relief the way in which wage labor in whatever form is enslaved. End quote. That quote is from R. Bandari, quote, the disguises of wage labor, juridical illusions, unfree conditions, and novel extensions. That's from Historical Materialism 16, 2008. Also cited as Slavery and Wage Labor in History, Rethinking Marxism. Banaji, Theory as History, Essays on Modes of Production and Exploitation. End footnote. Another option is to broaden the concept of the proletariat to include all commodified labor. From this perspective, the proletariat consists of all carriers of labor power whose labor is sold or hired out to employers, including individuals, corporations, and institutions, under economic or non-economic compulsion, regardless of whether these carriers of labor power are themselves selling or hiring out their labor power, and regardless of whether these carriers themselves own means of production. See van der Linden, Workers of the World, Essays Toward a Global Labor History. End footnote. Naturally, all aspects of this provisional definition require further reflection. Nevertheless, this conceptual demarcation indicates the common class basis of all subaltern workers, the coerced commodification of their labor power. According to both approaches, all constituents of this redefined proletariat share their exploitation by employers and the commodification of their labor power. Therefore, they share a common class interest in the transcendence of capitalism. Recent historical research has, for instance, revealed concrete cases of struggles conducted jointly by slaves and, quote, free and, quote, wage earners. Footnote. See Linebaugh and Redeker, The Many-Headed Hydra. End footnote. At the same time, the short and medium-term interests of segments of this new broad-spectrum proletariat can diverge strongly. This redefinition of the proletariat comes at a price, though. If we accept that not only, quote, free and, quote, wage earners are integral parts of capitalism, but also chattel slaves and other groups of workers, then both variable capital, quote, free and, quote, laborers, and fixed capital, slaves, are capable of producing value and surplus value. A new theory of value will then become necessary. Footnote. Note that from a logical point of view, quote, the labor theory of surplus value is ... unnecessary to the moral claim Marxists make when they say that capitalism is exploitative, end quote. G.A. Cohen, History, Labor, and Freedom, Themes from Marx, 1988. That's the end, so I'm going to read the references, but you can sign off now. Actually, I'm not going to read the references because there's a million of them, so fuck that. It's over. Thanks for listening. I'm sorry about the lawn mowing. I'm sorry about how terrible the recording is. I'm sorry. Forgive me. I'll self-harm if you want me to. Alright, bye-bye.